Finding purpose in pain. The turning point. Sandra woke up to the sound of the alarm buzzing on her bedside table. It was early, just as the first light of dawn was creeping into the room. She stretched lazily and reached out to Stephen, her husband of 12 years, only to find his side of the bed cold and empty. She could hear muffled voices coming from downstairs. Stephen was in his home office, discussing something on the phone. From the urgency in his voice, it sounded important. Curious and slightly concerned, Sandra got out of bed and wrapped her robe around her. She padded downstairs quietly and found Stephen pacing back and forth, his voice low but intense. He noticed her standing in the doorway and raised his hand, signaling for her to wait. "Just a moment," he whispered. After what felt like an eternity, he finally hung up the phone. He turned to her, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Sandra," he said, rushing over to her. Without a word, he picked her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing like a man who had just won the lottery. "The Lord has done it," he exclaimed, still holding her tightly. "I got the contract, the one I've been working on for months. We're going to be fine. Everything's going to change." Overwhelmed with joy, Sandra hugged him back, laughing along with him. It was a breakthrough they had prayed for. Stephen had been tirelessly working on securing a major government contract for his company. This would change everything for them. After years of hard work and uncertainty, they could finally relax and enjoy the fruits of their labor. Their joy spilled over into the coming months. With the new income, they bought new cars and enrolled their 2 children in a prestigious private school. They even managed to travel, something they had dreamed of for years. Friends and family marveled at their success, some envious but most genuinely happy for them. Stephen and Sandra felt unstoppable, as if nothing could go wrong. The shadows loom. Years passed, and life continued on a seemingly perfect trajectory for the family. Stephen's business flourished, and they traveled during every school holiday, exploring exotic destinations around the world. Their social status rose as they mingled with influential people. The house was always filled with laughter, and their children thrived in their new school. From the outside, they were the picture of a happy, successful family. But as is often the case, life has a way of shifting without warning. One evening, Stephen returned home late after dropping their son, Daniel, at his boarding school. It was past midnight when he arrived, his body heavy with fatigue from the long drive. Sandra had stayed up, waiting for him in the living room with their daughter, Maria, who had fallen asleep on the couch. The two exchanged small talk about their son's school, the drive, and how Maria had insisted on waiting up for him. They both laughed softly, careful not to wake her. After a few more moments, they decided to go to bed, exhausted but content with their busy, fulfilling lives. As they lay down, however, a strange noise interrupted the quiet of the night. It came from the back door, a faint creaking sound that instantly sent a chill down Sandra's spine. Startled, both of them sat up, their eyes wide. Stephen motioned for Sandra to stay put, but she followed him cautiously as they went to investigate. When they reached the kitchen, they were met with the terrifying sight of 3 masked men, armed and menacing, standing by the door. The intruders pointed guns at them, barking orders to hand over their money and valuables. The night of terror. Stephen, his heart pounding in his chest, tried to remain calm. He raised his hands in surrender, pleading with the men. Okay, I'll give you what I have," he stammered, moving towards the safe in the corner. His mind raced as he opened it, pulling out the cash and jewelry they kept for emergencies. "This is all we have here. Please, just take it and go." But the men weren't satisfied. One of them grabbed Sandra by the arm and threw her to the floor, while another continued to demand more money. Stephen, trembling with fear, tried to reason with them, offering to get more from the bank in the morning. His pleas, however, fell on deaf ears. The men were ruthless. One of them pinned Sandra down, and before Stephen could react, they began taking turns violating her. Stephen's world shattered in that moment. He screamed, begged, and tried to fight them off, but they threatened to kill him if he moved. Helpless, he could only watch as the nightmare unfolded. When the men were finally done, they left without a word, disappearing into the night. Stephen rushed to his wife's side, his hands shaking as he tried to comfort her. She was broken, physically and emotionally. They went to the hospital immediately, where doctors confirmed that Sandra had suffered severe trauma and had contracted an infection as a result of the attack. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, police reports, and desperate attempts to make sense of the horror that had descended on their lives. The silent wounds. Sandra was discharged after 2 days, but life was far from normal. The once lively house was now filled with silence and an overwhelming sense of dread. Neither Stephen nor Sandra knew how to navigate the aftermath of the attack. They were ashamed, humiliated, and most of all, they felt abandoned. Despite their friends' concern, they couldn't bring themselves to talk about what had happened. The strain on their marriage grew as the months passed. Sandra, despite her best efforts, could not hide the emotional and physical scars that the attack had left on her. Stephen, overwhelmed with guilt and shame, withdrew into himself. He couldn't bear to touch his wife, the trauma of that night playing over and over in his mind. They both knew they needed help but were too afraid to seek counseling. 1 year passed, and the distance between them had only grown wider. Sandra made countless attempts to talk to Stephen, but he always avoided the conversation. Desperate for a fresh start, Sandra decided to leave Nigeria temporarily and pursue her master's degree in Rwanda, hoping the time apart would bring healing and clarity for both of them. The rift deepens. While Sandra was away, Stephen found solace in another woman, a colleague from work. It started innocently enough: long hours at the office, late-night conversations that seemed harmless. But soon, it became an emotional and physical affair. Their children noticed the changes in their father's behavior and told Sandra about the other woman during their weekly video calls. At first, Sandra refused to believe it. She was heartbroken but clung to the hope that her marriage could still be salvaged. 2 years later, with her degree in hand and her spirit partially healed, Sandra returned to Nigeria, determined to confront Stephen and save their marriage. But when she confronted him, he didn't deny the affair. Instead, he admitted that he no longer wanted to be with her. His guilt, shame, and inability to process what had happened had consumed him, and he had moved on, emotionally and physically. The road to healing. After returning from Rwanda, Sandra found herself standing at a crossroads. Her marriage to Stephen had collapsed, and her heart was shattered, but she knew she couldn't afford to break down. She had 2 children who depended on her, and a new calling that had slowly grown inside her over the years: a desire to help women who had been victims of violence, just like her. With little time to grieve the loss of her marriage, Sandra channeled her pain into creating something that could make a difference. Sandra started small, first reaching out to other women who had confided in her about their own experiences of abuse. Together, they formed a support group, which began meeting weekly at a community center in Lagos. The women shared their stories, offering comfort and solidarity to one another. For Sandra, this was the beginning of something greater. The strength of these women, who had endured so much, fueled her resolve to do more. Over the next few months, Sandra began advocating for better support systems for sexual violence survivors. She contacted local NGOs, attended women's rights conferences, and began giving public talks, sharing her own story to inspire others. It wasn't easy. Every time she spoke, she had to relive the trauma. But each time, she felt a little stronger. With every woman she helped, Sandra healed a part of herself. As her work gained recognition, she founded an organization named Hope Rising, dedicated to providing counseling, legal assistance, and rehabilitation for women who had suffered sexual violence. She threw herself into the work, drawing strength from her children and from the women whose lives she was helping to rebuild. Slowly but surely, Sandra began to see herself not as a victim, but as a survivor, and more importantly, as a leader. Her success, however, did not come without challenges. The stigma surrounding sexual violence in Nigeria was still pervasive, and many were uncomfortable with the public attention her work attracted. Some of her former friends distanced themselves from her, uneasy about the cause she had chosen to champion. But Sandra had long since stopped caring about what people thought. She was driven by a higher purpose now. Stephen, meanwhile, watched from the sidelines as Sandra's life took on new meaning. He had moved on with his new partner, but something gnawed at him, a sense of loss and regret that he couldn't quite shake. Though he had ended the marriage, it became increasingly clear that he had also lost himself in the process. Stephen's regret. Stephen's life after Sandra's departure seemed to go on as planned. His business continued to thrive, and his relationship with his new partner, Kioma, appeared strong on the surface. But underneath the success and outward appearances, Stephen felt hollow. He hadn't realized how much of his strength had come from Sandra, and without her, life felt unstable in ways he hadn't expected. At first, he convinced himself that leaving Sandra had been the right decision. Their marriage had deteriorated after the trauma, and he had been unable to cope with the aftermath. But as time went on, Stephen began to see that the real issue wasn't Sandra. It was his own inability to deal with the guilt and shame he felt. He had run from the situation instead of facing it, and now he was paying the price. Seeing Sandra's rising influence in the community, her newfound purpose, and the lives she was changing only deepened his regret. He watched from afar as she became a prominent figure in the fight against sexual violence, while he remained stuck in a life that seemed increasingly superficial. His new relationship, once exciting, now felt empty. Kioma, while supportive, couldn't fill the void Sandra had left. Stephen's relationship with his children also began to suffer. Daniel and Maria, who had initially been sympathetic towards their father, grew distant as they saw their mother's resilience. Sandra had become a source of inspiration for them, and they admired her for her strength. Stephen, on the other hand, was a constant reminder of the family's past pain. His attempts to reconnect with them often felt forced, and their growing resentment was evident. One evening, while scrolling through his phone, Stephen came across an interview Sandra had given to a local news station about her organization. She spoke with poise and passion, sharing her journey and the importance of her work. As he listened, Stephen felt a pang of deep regret. He realized that Sandra had found healing, not by running away, but by confronting her pain head-on. And for the first time, Stephen wondered if it was too late for him to do the same. Finding purpose in pain. As Hope Rising grew, Sandra's workload increased, but so did her sense of fulfillment. She found purpose in helping women reclaim their lives, providing them with resources, legal advice, and emotional support. Over time, she established partnerships with local hospitals, law enforcement, and international NGOs. What had started as a small support group had become a national movement. But despite her success, Sandra still faced personal battles. Her children, now teenagers, struggled to cope with the divorce and the changes it had brought to their lives. Daniel, especially, had a hard time accepting that his parents were no longer together. He often lashed out in anger, blaming his father for the family's breakdown but also resenting Sandra for not fighting harder to save the marriage. Sandra tried her best to be there for them, even as she juggled the demands of her growing organization. She encouraged them to express their feelings, knowing that they had been deeply affected by the trauma as well. But she also understood that healing takes time. As much as she wanted to protect her children from the pain, she knew they had to go through their own process of healing. To cope with the stress of her work and personal life, Sandra started seeing a therapist. She had resisted therapy for a long time, feeling ashamed of needing help, but now she realized that if she was going to continue helping others, she needed to take care of herself first. Therapy became a space where she could process her own grief, anger, and the lingering effects of the assault. It was during one of these sessions that Sandra had a breakthrough. Her therapist asked her to think about forgiveness, not just for the men who had violated her, but for Stephen as well. It was a difficult concept for Sandra to accept. She had harbored so much resentment towards him, especially after learning about his affair. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that holding onto anger was only hurting her. In the months that followed, Sandra began to let go of the bitterness she had carried. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once, but with each passing day, she felt a little lighter. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive Stephen, but she knew that in order to move forward, she had to stop letting the past define her. A new relationship with herself. As Sandra grew into her role as a leader and advocate, she also began to discover new parts of herself. For so long, she had been defined by her roles as a wife and mother, and then as a survivor. Now, she was learning to define herself on her own terms. She rediscovered her love for writing and started a blog where she shared her experiences, not only as a victim of sexual violence but also as a woman navigating life after trauma. Her writing resonated with people all over the world. Women from across Africa and beyond reached out to her, thanking her for her honesty and vulnerability. Sandra was surprised by the overwhelming response, but it reaffirmed what she had known all along: that sharing her story could bring healing, not just to herself, but to others. Through her blog, Sandra also reconnected with old friends and made new ones. Her social circle expanded beyond the world of women's rights advocacy, and she found joy in simply being herself again. She started traveling for pleasure, not just for work, and spent time exploring new hobbies, like painting and gardening. For the first time in years, Sandra felt whole. Meanwhile, Stephen's life continued on its downward spiral. His relationship with Kioma ended, and his business, once thriving, began to face setbacks. He had lost the passion that had once driven him, and without Sandra by his side, he struggled to maintain the same level of success. His regret grew, but he didn't know how to reach out to Sandra. Stephen's reckoning. Stephen's breaking point came one evening when he received a letter from his son, Daniel. The letter was brief but cutting. Daniel expressed his disappointment in his father, accusing him of abandoning their family and failing to take responsibility for the trauma they had all endured. It was a wake-up call for Stephen, one he could no longer ignore. Realizing he had lost not just his wife, but also the respect of his children, Stephen decided it was time to face his past. He reached out to a therapist, something he had avoided for years, and began the difficult process of confronting his own guilt and shame. He acknowledged that he had failed to support Sandra when she needed him most, and that his affair had been a cowardly attempt to escape his pain. For the first time, Stephen allowed himself to fully grieve the loss of his marriage and the life they had once shared. It was a painful process, but it was also a necessary one. Through therapy, he began to understand that healing wouldn't come from external success or distractions. It had to come from within. He also reached out to Sandra, not to ask for forgiveness, but to apologize. It wasn't an easy conversation, and Sandra was hesitant at first. But Stephen's sincerity was undeniable. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had failed her, and that he deeply regretted the choices he had made. Sandra listened, her heart heavy, but she appreciated his honesty. It was the closure she hadn't realized she needed. Rebuilding bonds. With time, Sandra and Stephen began to rebuild their relationship, not as husband and wife, but as co-parents and, eventually, as friends. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but they both made an effort for the sake of their children. Daniel and Maria, seeing their parents work together, began to heal as well. For Daniel, his relationship with his father was the most difficult to repair. He had looked up to Stephen for so long, and the betrayal he felt after the divorce had left deep scars. But Stephen's consistent effort to make amends gradually softened Daniel's heart. They began spending more time together, and slowly, their bond was restored. Maria, on the other hand, had always been closer to her mother. But as she grew older, she began to see her father's humanity and understood that he, too, had been a victim of his own pain. She forgave him more easily than her brother did, and her relationship with both parents remained strong. Sandra, for her part, focused on maintaining the balance between her personal and professional life. Hope Rising continued to expand, and she became a sought-after speaker at international conferences. But she never lost sight of what mattered most, her family. She spent more time with Daniel and Maria, making up for the years when she had been consumed by work and grief. Rising from the ashes. As the years passed, Sandra's life took on a new rhythm. Her work with Hope Rising flourished, her children grew into independent, compassionate adults, and her relationship with Stephen settled into one of mutual respect and understanding. She had risen from the ashes of her past, stronger and more empowered than ever before. Sandra no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstance. She had taken control of her life and turned her pain into a source of power. The trauma that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the foundation upon which she built her new life. And through her work, she had helped countless other women do the same. Stephen, too, found peace in his own way. He continued therapy and rebuilt his life, though it was far different from the one he had envisioned. He remained involved in his children's lives and became an advocate for men's mental health, sharing his own journey of redemption. Sandra's journey was far from over, but she was no longer the broken woman who had been helpless in the face of tragedy. She was stronger now, not just for herself, but for her children and for the countless women who looked to her for inspiration and support. With each passing day, she rebuilt her life, piece by piece, determined to rise from the ashes. And in doing so, she found that her greatest strength lay not in avoiding pain, but in facing it head-on, and helping others do the same.